Yes, we're going to talk about the callback queue. So timeouts. Console log. Hello. Can someone explain me what this does, just quickly? Yes.
It's calls the function, set timeout every 2 seconds or 2000 milliseconds. It will say hello, hello, hello.
It'll just do it once.
Oh.
Yeah. The other one is called set interval.
Okay, so it delays the console how long? 2 seconds, and then it calls it.
Yes, exactly. So set timeout. It takes 2 arguments. Can someone explain me what those 2 are?
It can be a function or
Yes.
And the time.
Yes. And what do we call the function normally?
Like an object.
We call it the callback function.
Callback.
It's like a callback. Because set timeout says after 2 seconds, call this function. Okay? So before we wrote this like this. Okay? It's exactly the same. So now we do it with the arrow functions. Okay? Does anyone know what happens in the browser and with the call stack and these things when this happens? When a timeout is being set, for example. Yes?
I think the set timeout is then handled by the web API.
Yes.
It goes over and
Exactly.
then it's sent to the calls stuff. No, first then the queue, the task queue. Yeah. And
Yes. That's exactly right. So we have these 3 entities. We have the call stack. We have the web API. And then we have the callback queue. Okay, so what happens here is when we call a function, what do we then do in regards to the call stack? We add that function to the call stack. Okay, so we add here a function called set timeout. Set timeout. We add it to the call stack. To the call stack. What happens now is the JavaScript call stack. It cannot kind of wait for 2 seconds and then do something. It just runs something when it comes to the call stack. It runs it and then it removes it from the call stack. So what happens here is the call stack kind of looks, oh, it's a set timeout. Perfectly. I don't need to do that. The web API can do that. That means the browser, right? So the call stack tells the browser, hey browser, I want a timer for 2 seconds. Okay? But then the browser goes, okay, yeah, I can set up a timer for 2 seconds. But after those 2 seconds, like, what should I do? What should I do? So the call stack is like, oh, you can just call my callback function, because that's what I want. So over here, we said this is like a timer, right? When this timer has done, we have a callback function that we would like to run. Okay? So now the call stack is like, hey browser, set a timer for 2 seconds and run this callback. Now we can remove this because we have run our function, and when a function is run on the call stack, we remove it from the call stack. Now we wait for 2 seconds. Then when these 2 seconds has run, then what the web API is doing is it's not just putting it on the call stack, because the thing is JavaScript can only do one thing at a time. So let's say we're doing some function over here, and suddenly the web API is like, hey, you need to run my function. It's like, no, I can't do that. I can only run one function at a time. Okay, perfect. So how they have done this in JavaScript is, instead of just adding it to the call stack again to run the callback function, we add it to the callback queue. So down here we have now not the timer anymore, that is done, but we have the callback function down here. How this works is the call stack, it checks the callback queue when it's empty. So when there is nothing on the call stack, it'll look in the callback queue and say, hey, is there anything in my callback queue? If there is something in the callback queue, this will get added over here. Function. It'll get run, and then it'll get removed, just like we normally do. Okay? But it's only if the call stack is empty. And if we have, let's say we have lots of functions down here, then the call stack, it will just take the first one that was added, so like the one that has been there for the longest, it'll take that, add to the call stack, run that function, and then it'll take the next one if the call stack is empty. Okay, so let's just, I think maybe you have seen this before. Because this visualizes exactly what I'm saying here. Okay, so this is with 5 seconds. Let's do it 10. Okay, so call stack, web API, and the callback queue. So we don't want this. We just want the callback. Okay, so it got. Let's try and see if we can. Here, the first thing is we added to the call stack, and the call stack says, "Hey, web API, you should do this because I can't do this." Let's resume it. It gets put to the browser, and it says, "Wait for 10 seconds. When it's done, call my callback function." So we wait for it to time out here, and then it's gonna go very quickly. Okay, we add it to the callback queue. Then the call stack checks if there is nothing on the call stack. It'll take the first element from the callback queue and call that. And now I broke it. Let's just try it again, but with 2 seconds. Save and run. So add it over here, down, add it to the call stack, call the function, and remove it. Okay?
If there's no time limit on it, does it go straight to the callback queue?
No. It still goes to the web API.
Okay.
But it's just a timer for 0 seconds.
Okay.
So it goes straight to the web API, straight to the callback queue, and then if there's nothing on the call stack, add it to the call stack. So that's why sometimes you will see this in your code, and you think like, what? Like this doesn't make any sense. But this is how you kind of say, if you have lots of things running at the same time, but you want to say, this function should be the last one that runs, okay? Then you just give it a timeout of 0, because then all the functions will just get added here like dung, 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 and they will be run first. But the function where you have a timeout for 0 seconds, it will get added to the web API, down to the callback queue, and only if the call stack is empty, then it will get added to the call stack. So that's why you see that sometimes. It's simply to push, to say this should run last.
So you can prioritize different things on your website, more important things?
Yes, but you shouldn't do it this way. This is, to me, when someone does this, and I've done it myself, but it's kind of an indication that something else is not, something is wrong. Rather, you don't want kind of set timeout to 0, because then maybe you're not completely in control of how you call your functions and stuff like that. But sometimes it's just you kind of have to. Okay, cool. Now let's continue to promises. So let's just first write like a promise and say constant set timeout promise. Resolve and rejects. Set timeout. Oh, let's just do this. and say result here. Okay, so I know probably you're all thinking like, more weird JavaScript syntax, but this is a bit weird, and you kind of need to learn it. So I really feel your frustration, and I've been where you are right now as well. But you will learn it, so don't be too scared about it. Okay, so a promise is like a new way of working with abstract code in JavaScript. And in the end of this, you will see kind of why it makes sense. But it's to make working with asynchronous code kind of into like object-oriented, functional programming, so we can chain different functions, like you saw with the filter and the map, where we say we can call .filter, we could give it a function, filter by rating, and then we could map it, and we can say get a rating, you know. Before promises, that was kind of difficult, but now with promises, it makes it's a lot easier to work with asynchronous code in JavaScript, and you'll see why. Okay, so a promise, it takes a function, and that function is called, let me just see.
Resolver, no?
Yeah, the resolver. It's called the resolver, this function here. It takes two parameters, one called resolve and one called reject. So basically what is going on here is that we create a new promise and we set a timeout for 2 seconds. When you make a new function, a new promise, you give it the resolve and the reject. When you call the resolve function, that means now I'm done with my asynchronous code, okay? And I want someone else to use that that asynchronous code. So how do people then use this asynchronous code? You call it a function called then, and let's just log out here, console.log. 2 seconds. Okay, so here we create a promise. When we call .then on it, that is the same as resolving it. So let's first run this code. Okay, so we see here, hello, that was just from the timeout. 2 seconds, that was from our promise. Okay, so when we call the resolve function, the promises.then function will get called. Okay, so let's say we did this a bit more like a function. Okay, we say a function, bring me some food. Okay, let's give it a parameter called food. Okay, this function, it returns a new promise. The promise function takes a function that has two parameters, resolve and reject. Okay, let's do exactly the same as before. After 2 seconds, we'll call the resolve function. So when we call the resolve function, the promises.then function is called. Okay, so constant food promise equals bring me some food, some pizza. Okay, so the food let's say pizza promise. Okay, pizza promise. Then we call a function, and that function, it returns the food that we wanted to get. So it takes a food, and let's say here console food. Okay.
Is that normal syntax to put the dot then right below pizza promise?
You
Yes.
can do it in different ways, but I prefer that.
Okay.
Yes, it's like many companies, many places you will find this style guide.
What happens if we do not put them after?
Then that, so basically the problem with standard callback is that if you use a function like get Ajax data and then you give it a callback, unless it may be that you don't need it, but even then that Ajax call will happen. But in case of promises, unless you put dot then this nothing will run. It will actually not go and try to resolve the promise. So unless you put dot then the set timeout will not happen. So that's the advantage, that if you don't use the promise, that promise will never get resolved.
Yeah, so how you kind of read this is, okay, I make a pizza promise, okay? So pizza promise dot then it's like now my asynchronous code has run and I'm kind of ready to get the data or the food or whatever it is I want to get. You could also kind of do another what should you call it? Another way of thinking about promises is, let's say here I have food, no pizza. Okay, so if for example Pancake, he wanted some pizza from me, right? And he's asking for a promise. So how he would do it is he would ask me, hey Benjamin, you know,
Give me some pizza.
give me some pizza, okay? And I'm like, okay, cool, you know, you can get your pizza, but what you'll get is not your pizza, okay? It's the promise. So I'm like, here Pancake, here is your promise, okay? But now Pancake is like, but I need to know when my pizza is ready. So how does he do that? He listens for the dot then.
Yeah.
Okay? So now Pancake, he has his promise exactly like we see here, right? Pancake says, bring me some pizza, Benjamin, right? Bring me some food, some pizza. He gets his promise straight away. Now what he does is he listens for dot then, okay? And me as a promise, what do I need to do? I need to, when I'm ready to give the pizza to Pancake, I need to call the resolve function with this pizza, okay? So what I do is like, Pancake, I'm resolving now. Here's your pizza, okay?
But the timer for who? For promise or for you? Like
For me as a promise, I decide. Try give me the pizza again, right? So Pancake is like, I want some pizza right now. I'm not like, I can't do it right now, okay?
So
I need 2 seconds. 2 seconds. You know, yeah, it's like 2 seconds.
And there is one more thing. So he promised me to give me some pizza. What if he can't, he does not have enough raw materials, he can't make a pizza.
Yes.
And when he can't make a pizza, then he will reject my promise that, okay,
Yes.
I can't fulfill your promise.
Yes. Because it's for me as a promise, it's a promise that I will give him some data. It might not be the pizza.
Maybe after
Because
2 years,
maybe I fuck up doing my pizza, right? Maybe I put in too much milk and it's like, oh no, this is a battle, you know? Then what I do is I call reject, because I'm like, there was an error. And what I give him is not pizza. Instead I give him an error, right?
pizza.
And Pancake is gonna be very sad. But how I give him the error is I call the reject function. And now how do Pancake know that there was an error? He calls .catch. Okay, .catch with an error. And then if he wants to see the error here, he can log out the error, or he can give me give the user some feedback based on that error. Okay? Yeps.
How does it distinguish if there's an error not here? Is it like an if-else statement somewhat?
Yeah, you could do it. It depends on it depends completely on how you program it.
Okay.
So it's when you create a new promise, it's your responsibility to create the code that either resolves or rejects.
If
Okay.
you look at this code like here, then there is some code. It's very similar to callback function. Like you want to do something when the promise gets resolved, or you want to do something when promise does not get resolved, gets rejected. And here the person who has the promise, they have full control that what will happen. So this is much cleaner code, because what will happen when this promise gets resolved, it's written here and it's not written here. But when you use a callback, the callback would be called by this function. So if it goes to more than 3 levels or 4 levels, that you call a function with a callback, then it calls something else with a callback, and then it's known as callback hell in JavaScript.
And I'll show you how that works here. So let's say we have a timeout for 1 second. 1 second. Elapsed. Okay. When this 1 second has elapsed, then I log out 1 second has elapsed, and I want to do another callback. Okay. And then I do like this. So it's like, when this 1 second has elapsed, I put up a new timeout for 1 second because I want to do something else. And I'm like, well, actually after that, I want to do a new timeout again. Okay. And again. So now you kind of see this structure where it goes like ding, 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 ding. Okay. It has like a name.
So it like the set timeout, it seems like it's very silly code, but suppose you are fetching a list of repos from GitHub. So first API call is that you want to fetch all the repos, and when you have the repo list, for each repo you want to fetch commits, and then for each repo you want to fetch like contributors or something. So you want to fetch something extra for each object in the response. So you have to make 4 or 5 API calls, and one after another, because you can't, if you don't have the first data, you can't make the second API call, you don't have the second data, you can't make third API call. So this kind of code, it looks very, it will like you have to bang your head to understand it. You may be very happy when you write it for the first time, but if you change it after 2 weeks, you have to really look like with a lot of attention so that you don't make a mistake. But if we had to rewrite the same thing using promises, it would look a lot more simpler.
And let's try and do that. Get timeout promise. It returns a new promise. Oops. It takes a function that takes resolve and rejects. And good old code here. We've done this like a billion times. We set a timeout for 1 second, so it's the same as down here, right? Okay, so when I call this get timeout promise, I'll get a promise that will wait for 1 second. When that 1 second has elapsed, it'll call the resolve, because it's like, now I'm done. Now I'll pass on the information to the caller of my function. So how we can do this is we can say get timeout promise. Timeout promise. I think I've called this another place. This. Okay. So then I'll call a function. So what this does is after 1 second, we see up here, we resolve. Okay, so we elapse 1 second and then we'll go into our callback function here. What we can do here is we can do return get timeout promise. Okay, and after this we can do like this. Okay, so compared to this where you kind of go in dun, 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 this is a lot easier because it's chainable. Okay, so you can call .then, that will return a promise. So that means before it was here we have a promise, right? And on that we know that we can call .then. But actually when we call a promises.then function, that will in itself also return a promise. Okay, so that means that this is a promise. Okay, we know that because when we call the get timeout we return a promise, but actually this is also a promise. Okay, so when you call .then on a promise, that in itself is a promise.
Yeah.
And we can use that because we can say, okay, so that means if I call timeout promise 1 and I call .then on it, okay, so that means here I return a promise. Well, I can call .then on that. Okay, and that will return a promise that I can call .then on. So we can chain it like this.
So that,
Okay.
That's one thing. Can we just have a story where would I in the future use it? Just don't I
Yes,
know
yes.
Like
Benjamin, so
what would I put here, like in Node, in anywhere? What would I use this?
so
For
the get ajax data,
Yes,
it
exactly.
was a callback, like it was a function which uses a callback. You can change it to so it returns a promise,
Yeah.
and then if you have a ajax function, like utility function which returns your promise, and then you can do something like fetch, make first API call, then make second API call, then make third API call.
Yeah, but I can do it without.
So if you do it without the promise, then it will be very indented, like it would be inside the callback, right?
Yeah.
So,
Back down.
In case of maybe.
so if you had some code which is async, and then if that async thing happens, you want to do something more async, like you don't know after how many times it will get resolved. If you are doing ajax call, here it's set timeout, so you know that after 1 second this code will run.
So all the thing is that there is something in the call stack. It's running, so I'm waiting for the call stack to be empty to run these, or
Don't think about the call stack too much in regards to this.
Just imagine like I am writing an application using Facebook API. So first thing is that I want to fetch a list of a profile of the current user. So I make that call, then I want to fetch all the friends of that user, and then I want to send a message to all the friends of that user. Like because to send a message you need to have the user ID of the person you want to send the message. So it's 3 API calls. So you can't have the list of friends unless you have the user object, and you can't send a message unless you have the user ID of each friend. So if you have to write a code like this using callbacks, it would be indented 3 times. And if you had to do a 4th thing and a 5th thing, suppose your application logic needed you to do all this, like you are showing a loader unless everything happens. It may happen, right? you are interacting with some API, and they say that to do this, here is this endpoint, to do this other thing, here is this other point. Then you put your logic, and you decide that to implement the whole business logic, like to implement the whole feature, you need to make 5 API calls. Then how will you write the code? So there is one way that you can write using promises. The other way is that you can use the callback.
But I'm doing also 5 callbacks here, but in a organized way.
But it looks very simple
Yeah, in
to read.
organized way.
Yeah.
Yes, exactly. That's the thing.
Yeah.
It's just
Okay,
syntax.
Yeah.
It's syntactical sugar.
Yeah.
It looks nicer and it's easier to read as well.
Okay, that's okay.
So readability does count in a large code base. So if you have a code base with like in my project in which I am currently working, we have 30,000 lines of TypeScript. So if you write bad code and you have 30,000 lines of bad code, then it's very painful to implement a new feature.
Like for maintenance and people.
Yeah. So because after having 30,000 lines, you also want to release new feature every week or something like that. So if you write bad code, your speed of implementing new features will be very slow. That's why you have these improvements like arrow function and then promises and things like that.
But let's do something a bit more concrete, because now we've been working with timeouts and bread and pizza and weird things, right? Let's do something a lot more concrete that probably like you could or you can write yourself and you're going to, but also that it would probably be normal for you to write this in a function or in a company you get into. Okay? Yes. So we have to get Ajax data. Okay? So what do we need to do to create this into a promise, do you guys think? So we have the get Ajax data. What it does, it takes 2 parameters, a URL and a callback. Okay? And the callback function gets called when there is data from the server. So that means it might take 1 second, 2 seconds, 3 seconds. We don't know. We just know that when we get the data from the server, then this is called, because we added an event listener on load. Okay. So it says like when we get the data, call the function that I gave to get Ajax data. Okay. So, and you've seen the use of it. It's like .demo /JSON, and then you give it a function. So it's like get some data from here. When you're done with that data, call this function. Okay. Now we don't want to do it with callbacks. We want to do it with promises. So what is the first thing we need to do? When we call the function, we need to yes, we need to return the promise. Okay? Because then when we return the promise, then it was this thing where I gave Pancake the promise, and now he can listen for .then or .what?
Cache.
Yes. .then gets called when what?
Resolved.
Resolve. .then gets called when resolve gets called, and the catch gets called when
Reject.
yes, reject an error. Okay, cool. So I'm glad you are listening to what I'm saying. Okay, so a promise takes a function that takes resolve and rejects. Okay. So now let's just get all of this in here. And as you see, always indent. Okay, because it's a lot easier to read. Okay, so now when we call get Ajax data, we return a promise. So let's see if that is actually true, just to begin with. Get Ajax data. And we want to give it a URL. Let's do I have the package? let's do the movies. The movies, and we give it a function. We are not gonna use that in just a second, but let's say const movies promise equals this. Okay, and let's log it out. And now we're probably logging like 1,000 things. So let's say here. Yes. Let's go to this. And let's reload it. Okay, so we are logging out something, and it's a promise. We can see something here called pending. So that means the state of the promise is like, I'm pending. I'm not resolved, I'm not rejected, but I'm kind of in limbo. Okay? And that's because we have just gotten the promise, but we haven't done anything with it yet. We're just logging it out the second we get it. And the second we get it, we haven't got any data yet or anything. So it's like, I don't know what state, I'm in pending state. Okay, cool. So now we know we have a promise, so we're pretty happy. Now, me as a promise maker, as a promise creator, I need to do some things. Can you help me with those things? What is it I need to do? Now I have returned a promise. That's like a good start. But there's two more things that I need to do. Two really important things.
Resolve.
Yes?
Resolve or reject.
Resolve and reject. I need to call resolve and reject. Resolve is when I have my data. Reject is if something went wrong. Okay, so can someone point me to where you think I should add first the resolve function?
When the state is equal to 200.
What, sorry?
When the data is loaded and the state is 200.
Yes, exactly. Okay, resolve. What should I give resolve as an argument? What, sorry? Yes, the data. So that means this is the data, right?
Yeah.
This is the response that we got, but it's in JSON format. So that means we pass a JSON and then we get a JavaScript object. Okay, so let's do it like this. Now we can remove the callback. Quite happy with that. Okay, so now when we get some data from the server, we resolve. What does that mean? What can I use that for if I want to know when my data is coming? If I want to run a function, what do I need to do then? So let's say down here we have our promise, and now I want to log out the data when I get it. What do I then do?
Then you dot then.
Yes, we use .then. Then let's do it like this. Okay, so the parameter that this function takes is what you pass in here.
Data.
Yes, so it's the data. So we say data, and then we can do console.log data. Okay, let's see if it works. Pretty quickly, yeah. So we got the data here. It's at 175. So that means here we have our data, and we could, return anything. We could return a string that says Benjamin, and then Benjamin is what we'll get here. The string Benjamin, and that's what we'll log out. So let's see the console. So when we have gotten our data, we log Benjamin out. So that means what you call the result function with is what you can get out of the .then function. Okay? But we need to do one more thing. What, sorry? Reject, yeah. Where do you think we should do that?
Else.
Yeah, we could do it in else. And where? Yes.
Also the server error.
We have an error here. So here we say the request that we sent to the server, if there is an error, then now we just log something out. But what we want to do is that we get that error. So what do I write here?
Check error.
Yes. And now we don't want to log this anymore. So let's remove that. So here we have an error object, and maybe we could say like, yeah, maybe it is already distinguished. So basically, dependent on your application, maybe you want to pass something else than just a string that says error, because that's a bit vague. But let's just do that now. Okay, so let's see if it works. Okay, so we get the data straight ahead. I'm thinking, can I just to kind of show you? So in Chrome, you can kind of say what kind of internet you have. So now I say that my internet is slow, so it kind of limits it. Let's go back into the console and I reload. And if I go into the network tab, so this is the request that I'm waiting for. So you can kind of seeing it, how long time it takes to respond. Yeah, so it's like, oh, now I got the response. It took 17 seconds and 84 milliseconds. And here I have the data. But so now we can try and see what happens if I reload it and I turn off my Wi-Fi. Because then I don't get the data from the server. And then I should get into my error function. Okay, so let's try and reload here. And say, oh, that's not the Wi-Fi. Like this, cancel. So it's trying to get the data. It's taking a long time.
What if we designate how long it will wait before it registers an error?
You never know.
Okay.
Yeah. So you just gotta handle when you get an error or when you get the response.
Okay. So in the past we said if we get error code, I think it was 404, then log error. But for these ones, if we don't have internet, is it just going to keep searching indefinitely if we don't specify what it will?
So if you can't make the request, it will fail immediately, and then we'll know.
Okay.
It will not retry. If you want to retry, then you have to implement a retry strategy. That you should retry after every 3 seconds, or maybe try for 3 seconds, and then after 6 seconds, and after 10 seconds, like Fibonacci says.
Okay, so you see here, for example, so I went to incognito and I tried to load the JavaScript and it says like, oh, the status is failed. So,
Uncaught in promise.
uncaught in promise. So that means,
There is no catch.
oh,
There's no clear error.
catch. Let's catch the error. And let's log out the error. Okay. So here we say, let's see where this, oh, that wasn't the right one. This one, 178. we see that now we are in the catch. We are not any longer in the .then, but we are in the catch. And what we see here is the error that we got from the server. And it's some kind of error. Okay? So that's the difference. So let's try and turn on the internet again. Yes, okay, so now we have like a practical example of how to get a URL or of creating a promise. So what if we now want to say we want to get the movies? When we have loaded the movies, then we want to get the Reddit posts from last week. Okay? But not just the Reddit posts from last week. We want to say when we get the data, we wait for 1 second, and then we get the data from the Reddit posts. Okay? Using promises.
Yeah.
Yes.
Was it a question?
Yeah, I guess. Yeah. Let's call it a question. How would we do that? How would we do that using promises?
Then we put set timeout inside here. Then set timeout for 1 second, and then we call again get Ajax data for new URL.
We want to use it with promises. And what we saw up here was that we can chain the promises, so we can say do this, when that is done, do this, when that is done, do this. But we need to return a promise.
So if you do a set timeout and you put the get ajax data using promises inside the set timeout, when JavaScript looks at your code, it will put set timeout to the web API, and then it will go to callback queue and the call stack. But by that time, the code inside then the function that has executed, so it will not return anything. It's happening in a different world. It's not happening there.
Yes. So it's if you do this, set timeout, and then we say for 1 second, right?
And here if you put return promise or something, it will not go to the next one.
Yes. So what happens here is that then it'll just set up a timeout, and then nothing will happen. Or if we do a .then, because what we want to do is we want to say when we got the data, then we are in here. Now we want to wait for a second, and then we want to call the .then. But what happens here is that we call .then, and we set a timeout for 1 second. But that doesn't matter. JavaScript doesn't care. It'll just do .then. Okay, and straight after the .then, it'll go down to the next one. It's not gonna wait for the 1 second. And that's because this is not yet a promise. We haven't kind of made this into a promise yet. So it'll just do, I'll log out the data. I'll set up a timeout function. When that function is done, I won't do anything. I'll just set it up. So this will be called, and it'll go down here just straight afterwards.
So putting the return statement here is meaningless, because if you put return here, then it makes sense. But if you put return in set timeout, then no one is listening for that function to return.
But what we want to do is we want to return a new promise, and you know what that takes?
Reject and resolve.
Yes.
Resolve and reject in that order. So you can call them anything, but the first argument would be used for resolving, and the second argument would be for rejecting. Yes?
Yes. So now, just so I understand it, we're calling our first API call. So that was the movie data, and then we want to call afterwards, say, what was it?
Then we want to wait for 1 second. Then we want to make API equal to Reddit.
With the catch, with the catch, whatever it's called, error, would it belong on the end, or would it belong in between the two?
So if you put
good
catch
question.
in between,
Yeah.
then catch needs to return a promise.
Okay.
But your promise is getting returned from the then. So it will already, if there is an error, it will jump to this catch.
Okay.
It wouldn't jump to the.
So it will try to find the next catch in the chain and then do.
Okay.
So
Try say that again.
So you have chained some then listeners and then some error listeners, right? So if it fails, it will jump to the next error listener, next catch statement, and execute that code.
And it will ignore all the things.
Yeah, so, but if you want to handle catch for each one, and then if you put a then statement after a catch, then that catch needs to return a promise. So if you put catch in between and you put a then after that, the catch needs to return a promise.
Not an error.
Yeah. So it needs to return something to which this can listen. So what happens that this whole chain, the function call will happen like one after another, and everything would be in a queue, or like something like that. It will not run immediately.
Okay.
So basically, put catch in the end. Don't put catch in the middle.
Okay.
Okay, but let's continue just this example here. Okay, so now we say instead of just setting the timeout, here we go. Instead of just setting the timeout, we are not doing this. Oh, I shouldn't have. Yeah, sure. Like this. And like this. Okay. So, what happens here is that after we've loaded our data, we return a promise that after 1 second resolves. What actually happens is that we return a new promise. That means this .then function, it doesn't just get like true or false or hello or something like that. It gets a promise. So the .then function is like, I got a promise. Probably I should wait until that resolves before I run my function, right? Because instead of just getting, if we just did, we didn't return the promise, but we just return hello. Okay, then we have a hello string. Okay, so here we return a string, and this function is like, oh, I got a string. Perfectly. We can just call that straight ahead. Don't need to wait, don't need to do anything. I just get the hello string and I can log that out. No problem.
No, I don't think that will work, because if you return a string, it will say string does not have a method called then. So you need to return a promise of
Are you sure?
No?
I'm pretty sure you can do that.
No.
Yes,
Cool.
because when everything we return in a .then function will in itself be a promise.
Oh, nice.
Yes.
I did not know that.
So the difference is just to let me explain. When we do this, it's still a function. It's still a promise. It just you can resolve it straight away.
I'm resolving the promise by then. So then would be like an expression has data in it.
Yes, exactly.
And then this data would be resolved by the next promise, or would be put in a promise.
Try say that again.
So I got the data here, like hello.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
So hello, I can execute it by the next promise, or
Yes.
I can put it in a promise inside the next.
Yes.
The then.
Yes. And what the difference is that when we return the promise,
Yeah.
now this dot then, exactly this one, it's like, ooh, I got a promise. Cool. I better wait until
Resolve.
that promise gets resolved. Okay? So it's waiting, it's waiting, it's waiting, it's waiting, it's waiting, and it's listening for the, the resolve. It's like resolve, now I will run my function. Okay? That's the difference. Here we return the promise, whereas when we just did the set timeout, like this actually, even though we don't do anything, this resolves, this returns instantly. So it doesn't matter whatever we do in here. This dot then function is like, oh, I didn't get a promise. I'll just resolve straight ahead. I'll just run the code that's in my callback function here. I'll run that the second I get it. Only in the case where there actually is a promise like this. This dot then is like, ooh, it's a promise. I will wait for that resolve, and then I'll call my callback function. So that's kind of the difference from just setting the timeout and returning the promise in the dot then.
So this one is like, I think if I remember, then it is called a promise which is already resolved. So it will create a promise on the fly for you because you have put a dot then, and which is already resolved. So it will not.
Yes.
It's not uncertain. It's certain that this promise will always resolve to hello because you have given a value.
Can you repeat?
So since you are returning a string,
Yeah.
it's going to get resolved. It will never fail. So JavaScript will create a promise because there is a then listener which will always get resolved to this string whatever you have put. But in case of Ajax API call, JavaScript can't tell that if the promise will get resolved or rejected. But if you have put a return statement in this kind of chain, it knows that it's going to get resolved always with whatever you put in the return statement. So there are two kind of promises now. One where you have some kind of certainty, like you have put return statement, and other one where you have put return new promise. If you create a promise yourself, then it's the responsibility of this code to resolve that promise. If you put a return statement, then it's responsibility of JavaScript to create a promise for you.
So here in the first promise, I would be proceeding with my data that I got. Like here, for example, I can map or work on the
Yeah,
Yes,
design.
you
yes.
can render it to the UI or do something. Yeah.
Exactly.
And the next then would be for.
If you want to
So
fetch
next
That depends on your
So
on
I
your
can
use
work
case.
on my data here, like on the movies I got, and I can fetch another
Yes.
inside the promise.
Yes.
basically, let us say, given if in this data, if we had some ID from IMDb, then you could use IMDb API to fetch number of user reviews for that movie. On IMDb website, you can find reviews for each movie, right?
Yeah.
So then you could make that API call, and if a user clicks on some movie, you could show that. So there can be many use cases.
That's. I'll just show you what you said there. So we first get the movies, and now we want to get the Reddit posts.
Yeah, if I want, yeah.
Okay. So now I can do return get Ajax data. Okay. The Ajax data. Now it just takes a string. Actually, we haven't updated that. We don't need the callback here anymore. So we can remove it from here as well. Okay. So now we say, after we have gotten the movies, let's call these movies, because then we're kind of on the same page. Okay, we get the movies. Then we say, return get Ajax data. And what does get Ajax data? What do we get from that function?
Object.
No. What do we return up here?
Promise.
Yes, we return a promise. So what does that mean for this dot then?
Wait for a promise.
Yes,
Yeah.
it's like, oh, I got a promise. I better wait for that promise to get resolved before I can run my function. Okay?
If there's no promise, it's like it's going to execute
Immediately,
Yeah.
like this. Yes. But now we are saying return get Ajax data. And it's like, ooh, that's a promise. This one likes that. Oh. I don't think it's like happy to get a promise. But it's like, I got a promise. I better wait for it to be resolved. Okay. Now, what do we get here then?
Promise.
Yes, the posts, the Reddit posts. Okay. Let's try and see if that is actually true. So here we first get the movies. We recognize that JSON. And then we get listing, data, children. We recognize this one as well, right? From the last exercise with all the title and the ups and the downs and all these. Okay?
And if you like just go to the network tab, and so here if you reload, you'll see that it happens after this one is done.
Can you slow
So-
it down?
Yep.
So when the first call has finished, then it takes some time to process, and then create a make a new request, and then that request happens.
Why don't we need to use the new keyword again? When we
Because
parse
you are
it?
creating a new object of promise type.
Okay, so
Promise is an
That's
object.
because the function, when we call the getAjax function, that will return a new promise. So that means we don't need to do it ourselves because the function does it for us. It creates a new promise that is resolved.
So promise
So
is
see
an
here, you saw it took like a long time, like the movies, and then straight when it was done with the movies, it started with the Reddit posts. Okay, so that's like this getAjax data took a long time to resolve, right? It took what? 18 seconds. 18 seconds. So this was called, and then we waited for 18 seconds, and then the dot then was called. Then what happened was we call getAjax data, we get a promise from that, and then we can just return the promise of the chain. So now we say when we got the movies, then we want the Reddit posts. And that's what we see here. Okay? But we can actually do this even better now. We can do like this. So now it's like, because you know that when we use arrow functions, that will automatically return. Okay, so now it looks like really nice. We say movies promise, getAjax data. That makes sense. getAjax data, and then we say dot. Then we have the movies. Then we say getAjax data again with the programmer humor, and then we have the Reddit posts. It's again, we are, like I said last time, we are working on kind of a higher level of abstraction. Because this nearly looks like I'm just talking, not only, but it's like, get this Ajax data, and then you do then you get some other Ajax data, and then you do this, and catch it if there is an error.
Well, it's much better experience than people who were writing JavaScript like 15 years ago. So it was really bad time.
I like this spotlight, by the way. It's it's like I'm really in the center of focus right now. I'm a little hot though.
I thought I was finally understanding JavaScript.
What? Sorry?
I thought I was finally understanding, like it was almost there, and not with promises.
Promises with a
Promise
something
now
new
is
called
very
new
hard.
keyword, right?
Yeah.
It's
Yes.
going to be new.
Okay. So, do you want to have like lunch break now, or should we?
We should take a lunch break and then we have
Yeah, let's do a lunch break.
I think I'm ready for bed.
Let's take a lunch break and come back at like 10 to 2 or something like
So
that.
there is, if you don't understand like different cases and if you don't get your questions answered in the class, it could be very difficult to understand everything on your own when you just like watch some YouTube video or read some blog post. So it may seem like we are doing a lot more theory these days and not doing so many fun exercises, but we need to learn these things.
Yeah. And it is difficult, and that's what I said in the beginning. For me, this has taken a long time to learn, like really getting the concept, especially the fact that a dot then also returns a promise.
Yeah.
I didn't know that for, I don't know, the first 2 months I learned about
I
promises.
forgot it, and then when it worked, then I remembered it.
Yeah.
It creates a promise on the fly.
Yeah. So we know it's difficult, but just like take it very simple, like one simple promise at a time. You know it you need to return a promise, and it takes a resolve and a reject. When you resolve, a dot then function is called. When you reject, a dot catch function is called. Like if you can get your head around that, then you're a really long way with promises. Okay.
If I want
So-
only, okay, answer. If I want only to fetch one, like only first URL.
Yes.
What is in what I have to call?
You just do like this. Like you can say.
No, I don't want to get to return promise.
Okay, then you can just do like this.
And do whatever you want to do.
And then here you can console.
Or I can use my movies here inside there.
Yes.
Like I
'Cause
have-
you can do like-
have my movies in- okay.
Const new movies equals movies dot map. And this is how we want to. This is what we want to do.
Mhm.
Yeah, but also can't you use a callback in this way because it
A-
doesn't need a promise or not.
You're using a callback. You're giving a callback to them, but here the callback is like the callback is sitting right here, and it's like the only benefit is that your code looks much more flat. It does not look nested. There is no other benefit.
So-
It's a benefit in terms of syntax and how the code will look and how much, like how complex is it to understand. So it's much simpler, but in under the hood the same things are happening.
Okay.
But as a programmer, you don't need to worry about. Like
The
it's
code.
much simpler. Like if you have to make 3-4 API calls, it's much simpler to read.
Yeah, sure.
And before also we used to pass the callback functions while calling it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
now no need of calling those.
So if
No.
you had to do 5 things, then you would have to create like lot of nested functions, nested callback functions, and then pass, and then like if you are doing like 10 lines of code here, and then you make that second call, and then you do 10 lines of code, and then so it would be like 100 lines of nested code, and that would be difficult to read.
It's kind of this versus this, and actually we can. It's that versus. It's that versus this.
You don't need to call this. You need to remove this.
Oh, sorry. Go. So it's actually this, more or less. This versus this. This is like it's like, oh, I set a timeout, then I set a new timeout, then when that is done, I set a new timeout, then when that is done, I set a new timeout. So, and you know, with functional programming, you can kind of just give it functions. So maybe you have like, let's say get movies, right? And then after you have the movies, you wanna say get movie GIFs, and then when that is done, you say process movies or something like that. This is so nice to read. It's like the map where we said first get the successful Reddit posts, then map it into the titles, like using a function called get Reddit titles. Here we're kind of doing the same thing. It's like set its timeout for 1 second. Then we want to get the movies. When that is done, we want to get the movie GIFs. When that is done, we want to process the movie. It's like super nice and easy to read.
We are getting our
But
resources now.
What, sorry?
We are getting the resources in the bin. So usually we work on this resource inside the bin, or after we fetch all the information, we start working on the information.
It will again
Like
depend on
which
the
is-
logic. Like if you make the second API call to fetch the second resource, you need first something from the first API call or the first resource, then you have to like pick few things from the response and then make the second one.
Because I have to wait if I call them all.
Yeah, so
together.
if you want to make two separate API calls and then merge their data and like process them together, then it would be more like this. But if the second API call is dependent on the first one, then you
Yeah, it depends on your needs. So.
yeah.
Okay, I got it.
Yes. I think when we come back, we'll do like a quick exercise, and then we'll do some
Some
this
new
context.
things.
Yeah.
What about the second promise? Is it looking for the second catch or the first catch? Like you can write now 3 catches here, or after these 3, then
Yeah, you
like
can.
3 catches, or like if you have only 1 catch, okay,
You can just change them like this.
immediately.
Yes.
Okay.
Then it's like if there is an error here, then this will get
Okay.
called.
Yeah.
Yes.
I thought I had to write all catches in the bottom.
No.
Now it's clear.
Yeah.
Thank you.
You should stop the record.
Yes.
Come back.